Before we dive into the depths of what might be the most meticulously orchestrated cover-up in American history, I need you to ask yourself one simple question. What would you do if you discovered that everything you've been told about a pivotal moment in history was a carefully constructed lie? The Roswell incident of 1947 wasn't just about a crashed weather balloon or even a simple military mishap. It represents something far more disturbing, a pattern of deception, intimidation, and information control that continues to this day. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to pull back the curtain on the sophisticated machinery of secrecy that transformed a desert town's encounter with the unknown into a 70-year experiment in manipulating public perception. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about government transparency, witness credibility, and the true nature of the evidence that's been hidden in plain sight. This isn't just another retelling of the Roswell story. This is an investigation into how power protects its secrets and why, after all these decades, those secrets still matter.
The most remarkable aspect of the Roswell incident isn't what happened on that remote New Mexico ranch in the summer of 1947. It's what happened immediately afterward, when the full weight of military and governmental authority descended upon a small desert community with surgical precision. To understand the true nature of the Roswell cover-up, we need to examine not the crash itself, but the systematic dismantling of truth that followed. This was no spontaneous damage control operation. The speed, coordination, and thoroughness with which information was suppressed suggests a well-oiled machine that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Within hours of Major Jesse Marcel bringing the strange debris to Roswell Army Airfield, something extraordinary occurred. The base, home to the 509th Bomb Group, the only unit in the world at that time entrusted with nuclear weapons, issued a press release that would send shockwaves around the globe. They announced they had recovered a flying disc. Think about that for a moment. The most elite, most secretive, most carefully controlled military unit in existence made a public declaration about capturing something from another world. These weren't amateur soldiers prone to mistakes. These were men who handled weapons that could vaporize cities, men who had been drilled in operational security to the point where silence was second nature. Yet for a few brief hours on July 8, 1947, the truth slipped through. Newspapers across America screamed headlines about the Army capturing a flying saucer. From Los Angeles to New York, the story dominated front pages. The public, already primed by weeks of flying disc sightings across the nation, seemed to be getting confirmation that something extraordinary was happening in their skies. Radio shows buzzed with speculation. Telephone switchboards lit up. For one electric moment, it appeared that humanity stood at the threshold of the greatest revelation in its history.
Then came the reversal, and this is where the story becomes truly fascinating from a psychological and strategic standpoint. By that same afternoon, higher command had completely rewritten the narrative. Brigadier General Roger Ramey stood before cameras in Fort Worth, Texas, displaying torn remnants of what he claimed was a weather balloon. The contrast could not have been more stark or more deliberately orchestrated. In the morning, the military confirmed possession of a craft from the skies. By evening, that same object had been reduced to mundane debris that any farmer might find scattered across their fields. But here's what makes this reversal so significant. It wasn't just a correction of a mistake. It was a masterclass in information control. The photographs of General Ramey with the balloon fragments were distributed widely, providing visual evidence that contradicted the morning's announcement. News editors, faced with official military statements and photographic proof, had little choice but to adjust their stories. Within 24 hours, the flying disc had been memory-holed, replaced by a simple, digestible explanation that required no further investigation. What the public didn't see was what was happening simultaneously in Roswell itself. While General Ramey was holding his press conference in Texas, military personnel were fanning out across the small New Mexico town, implementing a program of witness management that would become the template for decades of secrecy to come. Sheriff George Wilcox, the man who had first received Mac Brazel's report, found himself visited by officers who made it abundantly clear that discussing the incident further would not be in his best interest. Family members later recalled that the sheriff, normally an affable and talkative man, became notably reticent about those July days, carrying a wariness that never quite left him. Mac Brazel himself, the rancher whose discovery had triggered the entire sequence of events, experienced even more direct intervention. After bringing the debris to town and showing it to the sheriff, after riding out to the crash site with Major Marcel, Brazel simply disappeared for several days. He was reportedly held at the airfield, though the official explanation for this detention has never been satisfactorily provided. When Brazel finally returned to his community, neighbors and family noticed an immediate change. The puzzled curiosity he had displayed when first handling the strange materials had been replaced by a careful, measured dismissiveness. In subsequent interviews, he described the debris as nothing remarkable, just balloon material, his words carrying the flat affect of someone reciting a script rather than recalling genuine experience. The pattern repeated throughout Roswell. Military personnel visited homes where civilians had glimpsed the materials or overheard conversations. The threats were rarely explicit, rarely crude. They didn't need to be. This was 1947, a time when faith in government authority remained largely unshaken, when the military carried immense moral weight as the force that had just won a global war against fascism. In a small town where many families had members in service, where patriotism was woven into daily life, the subtle implication that speaking out might harm national security or invite personal consequences was devastatingly effective. At the base hospital, the information lockdown was even more severe. Nurses who had been working there for years were suddenly transferred to distant posts with startling speed. Glenn Dennis, the young mortician who received those peculiar calls about hermetically sealed caskets for small bodies, later recalled trying to contact a nurse he knew at the base, only to discover she had vanished from Roswell entirely. When they finally connected months later, she was evasive, frightened, unwilling to discuss what she had seen during those critical days. She had drawn sketches of strange beings with elongated heads and large eyes, but even showing him those drawings seemed to terrify her. This systematic suppression extended to the physical evidence as well. Trucks moved through Roswell at odd hours, their cargo covered and heavily guarded. Witnesses reported seeing crates being loaded onto transport planes bound for destinations unknown. At the crash site itself, soldiers combed the area with methodical thoroughness, ensuring that not a single fragment of the debris field remained. Ranch hands who worked the surrounding areas were warned away, told in no uncertain terms that the military now controlled that stretch of desert and trespassing would not be tolerated. What makes this suppression campaign so remarkable is its completeness. In an age before sophisticated surveillance technology, before computers could track and cross-reference witnesses, the military managed to identify and silence virtually everyone who had meaningful contact with the incident. They did so quickly, efficiently, and with minimal public notice. The machinery of secrecy that descended on Roswell demonstrated capabilities that seemed almost prescient in their thoroughness. Consider the documentary evidence, or rather the suspicious absence of it. Decades later, when researchers began investigating the incident in earnest, they discovered that routine military records from Roswell Army Airfield for the summer of 1947 had mysteriously disappeared. Flight logs, personnel rosters, daily activity reports, the standard paperwork that accumulates in any military operation simply didn't exist for those critical weeks. Whether through deliberate destruction or carefully orchestrated misfiling, the paper trail that could have illuminated what actually happened had been erased. The official explanation, when it finally came in the 1990s, would claim this was all about Project Mogul, a classified program using high-altitude balloons to detect Soviet nuclear tests.
But this explanation, while superficially plausible, raises more questions than it answers. If the wreckage was simply from a classified balloon program, why the initial press release about a flying disc? Why were intelligence officers, men trained to identify aircraft and experimental technology, unable to recognize balloon debris? Why was Mac Brazel held at the base for days if he had merely found remnants of a weather balloon? More troubling still, why did the cover-up machinery activate with such overwhelming force for something as mundane as a downed balloon? The military routinely dealt with crashed experimental aircraft and failed tests. These incidents were handled quietly, with minimal fuss, through established protocols. But Roswell triggered something different, something that suggested the stakes were far higher than protecting a balloon project. The architecture of silence built around Roswell in July 1947 reveals a government apparatus capable of rewriting reality with stunning efficiency. It shows us a system where witnesses could be intimidated into recanting, where documentation could vanish, where a story could be transformed from cosmic revelation to mundane mishap in less than a day. This wasn't amateur hour, this was professional-grade information warfare, and it worked so well that for 30 years, Roswell essentially ceased to exist in public consciousness.
Despite the overwhelming pressure to forget, to move on, to accept the official story, something extraordinary happened. The truth, or at least fragments of it, survived. It survived in the memories of people who had touched materials they couldn't explain, who had seen things that didn't match the balloon narrative, who carried the weight of their experiences through 3 decades of enforced silence. When these witnesses finally began speaking in the late 1970s, they would reignite a mystery that authorities had believed was safely buried. Jesse Marcel stands as the central figure in this resurrection of truth. As the intelligence officer who first handled the debris, Marcel had the credentials and credibility that made his eventual testimony impossible to dismiss casually. This wasn't some civilian with an overactive imagination or a desire for attention. Marcel had served with distinction through World War II, had been entrusted with the highest levels of military security, and had continued his career in intelligence for years after Roswell. When he finally broke his silence in 1978, speaking to nuclear physicist turned UFO researcher Stanton Friedman, his words carried enormous weight. Marcel's description of the materials he collected from Mac Brazel's ranch contradicted every aspect of the balloon explanation. He spoke of metallic foil that, when crumpled, would return instantly to its original shape without any crease marks. He described beams that looked like lightweight wood but possessed incredible strength, impossible to break or bend. Most intriguingly, he recalled symbols or markings on some of the debris, purplish figures that resembled hieroglyphs, definitely manufactured, definitely deliberate, but unlike any writing system he had ever encountered.
What makes Marcel's testimony so compelling is what he risked by coming forward. By 1978, he was retired, living quietly in Louisiana with no apparent motive for fabricating a story that would invite ridicule and potentially tarnish his military reputation. Yet he spoke with calm certainty about what he had seen and handled. He admitted that the official explanation of a weather balloon had never been accurate, that the debris he collected was nothing like balloon material, and that the public had been deliberately misled. Until his death in 1986, Marcel never wavered from these core claims, even as skeptics attacked his memory and motives. But Marcel wasn't alone. Once he broke the ice, other witnesses began emerging from the shadows of enforced forgetfulness. Glenn Dennis, the mortician who had fielded those disturbing calls about small coffins and preservatives suitable for bodies exposed to the elements, finally told his full story. The details he provided were specific, concrete, and verifiable in their particulars. He remembered the exact nature of the questions asked, the tone of unease in the officer's voice, the strange activity he witnessed later at the base hospital. Dennis's account of encountering a nurse he knew, seeing her pallor and evident distress, hearing her whispered confession about participating in an autopsy of beings that were not human, these elements formed a narrative that was either elaborate fiction or devastating truth. The nurse herself had disappeared from Roswell shortly after, transferred without explanation, her whereabouts unknown. Dennis kept the sketches she had drawn, simple line drawings of humanoid figures with large heads and eyes, and he spoke of how frightened she had been even to show them to him. The pattern of witness testimony that emerged in the years following Marcel's revelations showed remarkable consistency on certain key points. Multiple people described debris with unusual properties, materials that behaved unlike anything in their experience. Several recalled military personnel moving through town with unusual urgency and authority, implementing what amounted to a lockdown on information. Families of base personnel remembered loved ones who came home changed, subdued, carrying secrets they could never share. One particularly striking aspect of these testimonies is what they reveal about the psychological toll of enforced silence. Witnesses described carrying their memories like burdens, wanting to speak but fearing the consequences. Some had been explicitly threatened with fines or imprisonment if they talked. Others simply absorbed the ambient message that speaking out would be unpatriotic, dangerous, or foolish. For 3 decades, they lived with the cognitive dissonance of knowing their experience while being told it never happened. When researchers finally began systematically interviewing Roswell residents in the 1980s, they uncovered a community that had been collectively traumatized by the incident and its aftermath. Elderly ranchers recalled soldiers blocking off pastures. Areas that had always been open range suddenly declared off-limits under military authority. Shop owners remembered the strange atmosphere that hung over town in the days after the press release and its reversal, a sense that something important had happened and then been forcibly forgotten. The testimony of Mac Brazel's children proved particularly revealing. They had handled the debris their father brought home before he reported it to authorities. They remembered its strange properties, the way it couldn't be cut or burned, the lightness that seemed impossible given its apparent durability. Their memories, formed in childhood before the official narrative was imposed, retained a clarity and wonder that adult recollections often lacked. They spoke of their father's personality change after his days at the base, how a man who had always been forthright and curious became guarded and dismissive when asked about the debris. What's significant about these witness accounts is not just their content, but their evolution over time. Critics often point to inconsistencies or elaborations in testimony given decades after the events, but what they miss is the psychological reality of suppressed memory and delayed disclosure. People who have been intimidated into silence don't simply forget their experiences, they internalize them, turning them over privately, sometimes doubting their own perceptions in the face of authoritative denial. When permission to speak finally arrives, when they discover others with similar experiences, the floodgates open, and details that have been mentally rehearsed for decades come pouring out. The medical personnel who spoke of unusual activity at the base hospital, the ambulance drivers who recalled small coffins being requisitioned, the soldiers who admitted decades later to guarding hangars where nobody was allowed entry, each of these testimonies added another piece to a puzzle that refused to fit the official narrative. The cumulative weight of these accounts, coming from people across different walks of life with no apparent coordination or shared motive for deception, created a counter-narrative that proved impossible to suppress entirely. Perhaps most tellingly, the witnesses who came forward often did so reluctantly, only after extended persuasion by researchers or after learning that others were speaking out. This pattern contradicts the typical profile of attention seekers or hoaxers who generally can't wait to tell their stories. The Roswell witnesses had to be coaxed into disclosure, often expressing fear about potential consequences even decades after the incident. Their reluctance itself serves as evidence of the effectiveness of the original intimidation campaign and the lasting power of the silence that had been imposed. If the debris recovered from Mac Brazel's ranch raised troubling questions about what fell from the sky that summer, the persistent accounts of recovered bodies elevated those questions to an entirely different level of significance. Wreckage, however unusual, might conceivably be explained as experimental technology, secret aircraft, or advanced balloon programs.
But bodies, small humanoid forms that witnesses described with remarkable consistency, such claims pushed the incident beyond any conventional explanation into territory that authorities could neither acknowledge nor adequately suppress. Glenn Dennis's testimony about the bodies remains central to understanding this aspect of the Roswell mystery. As a mortician with a contract to provide services to the airfield, Dennis was in a unique position to receive information that others might not. The questions he fielded from the base, asking about preservatives for small bodies that had been exposed to elements, about hermetically sealed caskets in child sizes, these inquiries suggested preparations for something far beyond the routine handling of military casualties. Dennis's account of what happened when he later visited the base hospital has been exhaustively analyzed and debated. He described an atmosphere of tense activity, military police who seemed unusually aggressive in their desire to remove him from the premises, and, most significantly, his brief encounter with a nurse he knew well. This nurse, by Dennis's account, was visibly shaken, pale, and deeply disturbed. In a hurried conversation, she confided that she had assisted with an autopsy unlike anything in her training or experience. The beings she described were not human. According to Dennis's recollection of her words, they stood approximately 4 feet tall, with disproportionately large heads and enormous dark eyes. Their skin had a grayish or bluish cast. Their limbs were thin, almost fragile in appearance. The anatomical details she provided, sketched hastily on scraps of paper, depicted something that fit no known species on Earth. Shortly after this conversation, the nurse disappeared from Roswell, transferred without explanation to a posting that Dennis could never confirm. His attempts to contact her afterward were unsuccessful, and he later learned she had died young under circumstances that were never fully clarified. What makes the body accounts so significant is their persistence across multiple independent witnesses. Dennis wasn't the only person who spoke of small humanoid remains. Other civilians who worked with the military in various capacities, from ambulance services to mortuary functions, recalled unusual requests and strange activities during that July period. The specificity of their recollections, the consistent descriptions of size and appearance, the shared sense that they had glimpsed something extraordinary and forbidden, these elements weave together into a narrative that proves difficult to dismiss as mere fabrication or misremembering. Military personnel, though generally more reticent given their oath-bound silence, occasionally let slip fragments of confirmation. Some soldiers, speaking decades later under conditions of anonymity, acknowledged that the recovery operation at the crash site involved more than just debris collection. They described areas that were cordoned off with particular secrecy, where only the highest-ranking officers were permitted. They recalled the unusual seriousness with which the operation was conducted, a gravity that went beyond the recovery of experimental hardware. The official response to these body claims has evolved over time, revealing the difficulties authorities face in countering testimony that won't go away. Initially, the accounts were simply ignored or dismissed as obvious fabrications. But as more witnesses came forward, as researchers compiled extensive documentation of the testimonies, the strategy had to shift. The Air Force's 1997 report, attempting to explain the bodies as crash test dummies from experiments conducted in the 1950s, represented a particularly tone-deaf response that only deepened suspicions of a cover-up. The timeline problem with the dummy explanation is insurmountable. The Roswell incident occurred in 1947. The anthropomorphic test dummies weren't deployed until the 1950s, years after witnesses claimed to have seen small bodies at the base. To suggest that people were conflating memories from different decades, that trained medical personnel couldn't distinguish between crash test dummies and what they observed in 1947, requires accepting a level of witness unreliability that strains credulity. The explanation felt less like truth-telling and more like desperate improvisation from authorities who had painted themselves into a corner. Consider the implications if the body accounts are even partially accurate. The recovery of non-human biological entities would represent the most profound discovery in human history, confirmation that we are not alone in the universe and that contact has already occurred. Such a discovery would have implications that ripple through every aspect of society: religious, philosophical, scientific, geopolitical. The decision to conceal such a finding, while perhaps understandable from a certain governmental perspective concerned with preventing panic or maintaining strategic advantage, would constitute a lie of almost incomprehensible magnitude.
The handling of the alleged bodies, according to witness accounts, followed a pattern consistent with the highest levels of secrecy. The remains were reportedly first taken to the base hospital at Roswell for preliminary examination, then quickly transported elsewhere, with Wright Field in Ohio, later Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, frequently mentioned as the final destination. The speed of this transfer, the security surrounding it, the complete absence of official documentation acknowledging any of it, all of this suggests an operation of extraordinary sensitivity. Nurses who may have participated in or witnessed preliminary examinations found themselves reassigned with remarkable speed. Families recalled neighbors who worked at the base suddenly leaving town without farewells, transferred in the middle of the night to postings they couldn't discuss. The pattern of rapid personnel dispersal following the incident looks less like routine military rotation and more like deliberate witness management, scattering those who knew too much before they could compare notes or develop a coherent understanding of what they had seen. The body accounts introduce an element to the Roswell story that transcends the question of unusual debris or experimental aircraft. They force us to confront the possibility that the incident represented not just a technological mystery, but a biological one. If craft fell from the sky carrying occupants, then we're not discussing hardware alone, but intelligence, purpose, perhaps even intention. The nature of the questions shifts from what crashed to who was aboard, and ultimately to what have they been hiding from us. The government's handling of Roswell provides a masterclass in how official narratives evolve under pressure, how explanations shift to meet changing circumstances, and how the very act of repeatedly revising the story can generate more suspicion than the original incident. The progression from flying disc to weather balloon to Project Mogul to crash test dummies reveals not just changing explanations, but a fundamental pattern of deception that has characterized the official response for over 7 decades. The initial press release of July 8, 1947, announcing the recovery of a flying disc, remains one of the most fascinating documents in this entire saga. It came from Walter Haut, the public information officer at Roswell Army Airfield, under orders from Colonel William Blanchard, commander of the 509th Bomb Group. This wasn't some low-level enlisted man making a mistake. These were experienced officers in the most elite military unit in the world, men who dealt with classified information daily, who understood the weight of public statements. The brevity and directness of that announcement is striking. No hedging, no uncertainty, just a flat declaration that a flying disc had been recovered through the cooperation of a local rancher and the sheriff's office. For a few hours, the American military seemed to be confirming what the public had been speculating about for weeks, that the flying saucers being reported across the nation were real, and now one had been captured. The reaction was predictable. Newspapers went into overdrive, radio shows buzzed with excitement, and suddenly the eyes of the nation, indeed the world, were on a small desert town in New Mexico. The reversal came with such speed that it suggests pre-planned protocols for damage control. Within hours, as those explosive headlines were still fresh, General Ramey in Fort Worth was already presenting a completely different narrative. His press conference, with its display of balloon fragments and confident dismissal of anything extraordinary, was accompanied by photographs that would be circulated widely as visual proof. The message was clear and coordinated. A mistake had been made, enthusiasm had outrun facts, and the mystery was now solved. But even at the time, this reversal raised questions that perceptive observers couldn't quite dismiss.
How could trained intelligence officers mistake balloon debris for something extraordinary? How could men who dealt with cutting-edge military technology, who handled nuclear weapons and classified aircraft, be so fundamentally wrong about what they were looking at? The explanation required accepting a level of incompetence at the highest levels of military command that seemed inconsistent with the reputation and responsibilities of the 509th Bomb Group. For 30 years, the weather balloon explanation held, not because it was particularly convincing, but because it was the only official story available, and because the alternative seemed too fantastic to credit. The machinery of silence that had descended on Roswell ensured that contradictory voices were marginalized, that witnesses remained quiet, and that the incident faded from public memory. It was only when Jesse Marcel broke his silence that the cracks in the official narrative began to widen into chasms.
The reversal came with such speed that it suggests pre-planned protocols for damage control. Within hours, as those explosive headlines were still fresh, General Ramey in Fort Worth was already presenting a completely different narrative. His press conference, with its display of balloon fragments and confident dismissal of anything extraordinary, was accompanied by photographs that would be circulated widely as visual proof. The message was clear and coordinated. A mistake had been made, enthusiasm had outrun facts, and the mystery was now solved. But even at the time, this reversal raised questions that perceptive observers couldn't quite dismiss. How could trained intelligence officers mistake balloon debris for something extraordinary? How could men who dealt with cutting-edge military technology, who handled nuclear weapons and classified aircraft, be so fundamentally wrong about what they were looking at? The explanation required accepting a level of incompetence at the highest levels of military command that seemed inconsistent with the reputation and responsibilities of the 509th Bomb Group. For 30 years, the weather balloon explanation held, not because it was particularly convincing, but because it was the only official story available, and because the alternative seemed too fantastic to credit. The machinery of silence that had descended on Roswell ensured that contradictory voices were marginalized, that witnesses remained quiet, and that the incident faded from public memory. It was only when Jesse Marcel broke his silence that the cracks in the official narrative began to widen into chasms.
Most damningly, the timeline and flight records didn't support the Mogul explanation. Researchers who examined the Mogul launch logs found no missing flights that corresponded with the Roswell timeframe and location. The flights that did occur in the general area during that period were accounted for, with their crash sites documented elsewhere. The attempt to retroactively match a specific Mogul flight to the Roswell debris required assumptions about launch times, flight paths, and crash locations that the actual records didn't support. The 1997 follow-up report, attempting to address the body testimonies with the crash test dummy explanation, revealed how desperate the Air Force had become to close the case. The dummy experiments didn't begin until the 1950s, a full decade after Roswell. To suggest that witnesses were confusing events separated by 10 years, that medical professionals couldn't tell the difference between obviously artificial test dummies and what they claimed to have seen in 1947 was insulting to the intelligence of anyone paying attention. This explanation also required accepting that multiple witnesses, in separate testimonies given over different years, all independently conflated the same memories in the same impossible way. The statistical improbability of such mass false memory, all trending in the same direction with the same chronological error, makes the dummy explanation less credible than the original balloon story it was meant to supplement.
What the evolving official explanations reveal is a pattern of reactive rather than proactive disclosure. Each new explanation has emerged only under pressure from renewed public interest or damaging witness testimony. The government has never voluntarily offered a comprehensive, honest accounting of what occurred. Instead, each explanation has been the minimum necessary to address the specific questions being asked at that moment, with no apparent concern for how the new story fits with previous versions. This pattern of evolving lies has consequences that extend far beyond Roswell itself. It has created a template for understanding how governments manage controversial information, how official narratives are constructed and maintained, and how truth can be systematically obscured through a combination of denial, misdirection, and selective disclosure. Every subsequent mystery involving government secrecy, from Area 51 to modern UAP incidents, exists in Roswell's shadow, evaluated against the standard of deception that Roswell established. The fact that the official story has changed 3 times, from flying disc to weather balloon to Project Mogul to explanations involving crash test dummies, while the core witness testimonies have remained remarkably consistent over decades, tells us something important about where credibility actually lies in this case. When the government story evolves to match new evidence or counter new revelations, while ordinary citizens maintain the same accounts they've told since the beginning, it suggests that the architecture of deception is built on sand, constantly shifting to avoid collapse but never achieving stable ground. In the 21st century, as governments have begun acknowledging that unidentified aerial phenomena represent genuine mysteries worthy of serious investigation, Roswell has experienced a renaissance not as history but as prophecy. The patterns established in 1947, the mechanisms of secrecy and denial, the dismissal of credible witnesses, the evolution of official explanations, all of these elements are being replayed in contemporary discussions of UAPs with an eerie familiarity that suggests nothing fundamental has changed in how authorities handle these matters. When the New York Times published its groundbreaking 2017 article revealing the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, when Navy pilots came forward with accounts of encountering the now famous tic-tac objects, performing maneuvers that defied known physics, the immediate reference point for understanding these revelations was Roswell. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Trained military personnel observing something extraordinary, official reluctance to acknowledge the full implications, and a public demanding transparency from institutions that have historically provided anything but. The congressional hearings of the 2020s, where lawmakers have pressed military and intelligence officials for answers about UAP encounters, have been haunted by Roswell's ghost. Every assurance that the government is being forthcoming this time, every promise of transparency, every claim that lessons have been learned from past mistakes, all of it is evaluated against the historical reality of what happened in New Mexico. When intelligence officials testify that they're conducting serious investigations into unexplained aerial phenomena, the unspoken question in many minds is whether this represents genuine openness or simply a more sophisticated version of the Roswell playbook. David Grush's 2023 testimony before Congress, claiming that the government has long maintained crash retrieval programs and has recovered non-human biologics, sent shockwaves through the disclosure community precisely because it echoed what Roswell witnesses had been saying for decades. Grush, a former intelligence official with impressive credentials, was essentially validating the core narrative that researchers had pieced together from Roswell testimonies. That the government has recovered materials and potentially beings from crashed craft, that these materials have been studied in secret programs, and that information about these recoveries has been systematically withheld from Congress and the public. The response to Grush's testimony followed a pattern established at Roswell. Immediate pushback from some quarters dismissing the claims as unsubstantiated. Demands for more evidence while simultaneously maintaining classification on the very evidence being requested. Suggestions that the witness might be mistaken, might be misinterpreting information, might be motivated by attention-seeking rather than truth-telling. The familiar machinery of marginalization and doubt began operating just as it had with Jesse Marcel, Glenn Dennis, and other Roswell witnesses decades earlier.
What Roswell has taught the modern disclosure movement is that government acknowledgement of the unexplained comes in layers, each grudgingly conceded only when denial becomes untenable. First came admission that objects are being observed. Then acknowledgement that some of these objects display capabilities beyond known technology. Then acceptance that these phenomena represent a genuine mystery worthy of study. But the final threshold, the admission that some of these objects might represent non-human intelligence and that materials from such craft might have been recovered, that barrier remains as fortified as ever.
The persistence of Roswell in contemporary discourse reveals how the incident has evolved from a specific historical event into a framework for understanding governmental secrecy around the UFO phenomenon. It's no longer just about what happened in 1947, but about what Roswell represents, the original template for how authorities manage information about potential non-human contact, how they balance national security concerns against public interest, and how they navigate the impossible space between admission and denial. Modern researchers studying the Navy's Tic Tac encounters or the various radar tracking cases that have emerged in recent years inevitably circle back to Roswell because the questions are fundamentally the same. If materials have been recovered, where are they? If beings have been encountered, what happened to them? If secret programs exist to study these phenomena, who controls them? Who has access? And under what authority do they operate outside normal governmental oversight? These are questions that Roswell first posed and that remain unanswered 7 decades later. The frustration within the disclosure community stems partly from this sense of déjà vu. The same battles are being fought, the same arguments deployed, the same deflections offered. When military officials testify that they cannot discuss certain matters in open session due to classification concerns, when they promise that more information might be available in classified briefings, when they assure lawmakers that investigations are ongoing but cannot share results publicly, all of this echoes the circular non-answers that have characterized official responses since 1947.
Roswell has also provided a roadmap for how to evaluate official claims. When the government offers explanations for UAP incidents, the disclosure community applies what might be called the Roswell test. Does this explanation account for all the witness testimony? Does it require dismissing credible observers as mistaken or incompetent? Does it evolve over time as new evidence emerges? Has evidence been classified or destroyed? The patterns identified at Roswell have become diagnostic tools for assessing the credibility of contemporary official narratives. The modern disclosure movement has also learned from Roswell the importance of preserving witness testimony before it's lost to time or intimidation. The fact that researchers were able to interview Roswell witnesses in the 1970s and 1980s before many had passed away created a documentary record that has proved invaluable. Today's disclosure advocates are actively working to ensure that contemporary military witnesses, pilots who've had UAP encounters, radar operators who've tracked unknown objects, are able to tell their stories on the record before the opportunity is lost. What makes Roswell's echo so powerful in the current moment is that the technological capabilities being attributed to modern UAPs, instant acceleration, hypersonic velocities without sonic booms, transmedium travel between air and water, these match the kinds of extraordinary properties that witnesses described for the Roswell debris. The self-healing metal Marcel spoke of, the materials that seem to defy known physics, find their parallel in contemporary accounts of craft performing maneuvers that shouldn't be possible given our understanding of aerodynamics and propulsion. The question that haunts the modern disclosure movement, inherited directly from Roswell, is whether genuine transparency is even possible when dealing with phenomena that might represent non-human intelligence. If the government has indeed recovered materials, if there have been encounters with beings from elsewhere, the implications are so profound, the potential for social disruption so significant, that full disclosure might be deemed too risky, regardless of democratic principles about governmental transparency and public right to know.
Roswell taught us that secrecy, once established, becomes self-perpetuating. The initial decision to hide what was found creates a cascade of necessary subsequent deceptions. Each generation of officials inherits not just the secret, but the apparatus built to protect it, until the cover-up itself becomes more important than what's being covered. The modern disclosure movement is essentially asking whether that cycle can be broken, whether 7 decades of secrecy can be unwound, whether truth can finally overcome the inertia of institutional deception.
After 30 minutes of examining the Roswell incident, not as a simple crash, but as a sophisticated exercise in information control and public manipulation, we're left with a question that extends far beyond one desert town in 1947. What happens to truth when power decides it must be hidden? The Roswell case represents more than just an unexplained event. It represents the moment when the modern national security state demonstrated its capacity to simply overwrite reality, to replace what witnesses experienced with what authorities claimed happened, and to maintain that false narrative for generations. The witnesses who spoke of extraordinary materials, of small humanoid bodies, of military intimidation and systematic suppression, they didn't have the burden of proof that skeptics demanded. They simply had the burden of memory, of carrying knowledge that contradicted official reality, of living with the cognitive dissonance between what they knew and what they were told to believe. Some took that burden to their graves. Others found the courage to speak despite the costs. Their testimonies, consistent across decades despite having no opportunity to coordinate their stories, remain the most compelling evidence that something profound occurred. The evolution of official explanations, from flying disc to weather balloon, to Project Mogul to crash test dummies, reveals a fundamental contempt for public intelligence. Each iteration expected citizens to accept that trained military personnel, intelligence officers, and base commanders were somehow catastrophically mistaken about what they had recovered and handled. Each explanation required dismissing witness credibility while demanding absolute faith in governmental honesty. The pattern doesn't suggest innocent confusion. It suggests deliberate, systematic deception that has been maintained across multiple administrations and generations of officials. What Roswell ultimately teaches us is that secrecy, once weaponized, becomes almost impossible to overcome. The apparatus built to protect the initial secret develops its own momentum, its own justifications, its own constituency of beneficiaries who have careers and reputations invested in maintaining the lie. The truth becomes not just hidden, but structurally protected by layers of classification, by the destruction of documentation, by the dispersal of witnesses, and by the deployment of official explanations that evolve just enough to deflect each new revelation without ever admitting the fundamental deception. The modern disclosure movement exists in Roswell's shadow, fighting the same battles against the same institutional resistance. Every new witness who comes forward with accounts of UAP encounters, every pilot who risks career consequences to describe what they've observed, every whistleblower who speaks of secret programs and recovered materials, they're all walking paths first tread by Jesse Marcel, Glenn Dennis, and the others who refuse to let Roswell be completely buried. Their struggle is the struggle for reality itself, for the right of citizens in a democratic society to know what their government knows about phenomena that might represent the most important discovery in human history. Whether a craft from another world crashed in Roswell in 1947 remains, in the strictest sense, unproven. But what is absolutely proven, documented beyond any reasonable doubt, is that the government lied about what happened, intimidated witnesses into silence, destroyed evidence, and has spent 7 decades changing its story every time the previous version became untenable. That pattern of deception, that demonstration of how thoroughly truth can be suppressed when power decides it must be hidden, that is Roswell's lasting legacy. It's a legacy that should concern anyone who believes that governments should be accountable to the people they serve, that truth matters more than institutional convenience, and that the biggest secrets might be the ones we most deserve to know.
Thank you for joining me in this examination of Roswell as a case study in governmental deception. The mystery endures not because we lack answers, but because the answers we've been given keep changing. And perhaps that's the most telling answer of all.